This view right here, it does something. Any idea what that might be? I'll just walk around for a moment and just take it in. As we round our pathway that we built a couple of episodes, and we really take in all of the custom trees that we have around here, but then we turn the corner and we see the house up on the hill, and, you know, ignore the horse up there doing its thing. But we've got our house, we've got our trees, and the little pathway that sort of rounds this bend right up next to this cliffside, and we see this bridge right here. Not only that, but we have the sunlight shining down on this singular flower right here through the canopy that sits above. All of these things have something in common, and it's something that I haven't really brought up too much in this world as of yet. But all of these little things, they make you feel something. And I think first and foremost, that comes from an art perspective. One thing that I've been trying to do a lot more in this world is approach building as an art form. So rather than just wanting to build something cool for the sake of building something cool and worrying about how it looks in Minecraft and what blocks I use, and all of the traditional things that you might think of when it comes to building, at least on a more basic level, my approach in this world has instead been, how do we make it art? And more specifically, what are some artistic techniques that we can use to paint a picture? Now, obviously, we're not literally painting a picture. I'm not even drawing the things out before I build them. But I think for the most part, there's a lot of overlap that can be had between art and building in Minecraft, and they can be one and the same a lot of the time. I think the most impactful thing when it comes to art of any form is what it can do to us as humans. The emotions that it can draw out of us, whether it's listening to a powerful song, whether it's looking at a piece that you could look at for hours because of all of the details, or maybe a book you read that by the end of it, you don't know what to do with your life because you just can't handle the fact that it's over. All of these different art forms and all of these different methods, they all make you feel something, and I think that's the power of art. And I think that can also apply to builds in Minecraft. Now, that's not to say that everything that we've built up to this point in this world is necessarily anything that powerful. That being said, this area is the start of something that, when added to everything that we build in the future, and as it comes together piece by piece, will eventually create a much larger piece that does leave you feeling something much, much stronger. What exactly it leaves you feeling is a little different from person to person, but I think that's part of the fun of art, is how it can be interpreted and how it can make one person feel versus another. So why am I mentioning all of this talk about art and how it makes you feel and how we can tie that into building in Minecraft? Well, as we cross our bridge right here, we are not just literally crossing a bridge, but we are also metaphorically crossing a bridge. Over there, on the far side of the river, we've got the fantasy area of our world here, of the Inspire project. Everything beyond this bridge, off in that direction, and everything to the left of this line of trees right here. That is going to be our fantasy region. Now, we will split this into 3 different areas, and the area beyond the trees, over where we have our sheep farm and recently constructed moss contraption, all of that will be determined in the future. But for now, we are going to cross the bridge and shift our focus to this side of the river and everything that lies beyond in this field here. Now, there is a specific style that I intend to build with over in this area, but one of the biggest things that I want to do alongside the style that we're going to be using is that I want you to feel something. Whether it's just crossing this bridge, whether it's walking through the area, whether it's watching it get built, whatever it might be, this area is going to be about more than just catching your eye. I want this to also catch your mind. I want this area over on this side of the bridge to tell a story just by looking at it. And as we walk through it in the future, once we have more of it built up, I want you to feel like you're experiencing a story just by being here and by taking in all of the sights and sounds. I think that is powerful. And it's not really something that I've done in building before. Most of my building up to this point might be a part of a larger story, sure, but the builds themselves don't often tell a story themselves. And I think that's going to be a really interesting thing to play around with here, alongside everything else that we've been doing in the name of becoming better builders. This is something that I'll be doing in this episode, but it's also something that I want you to consider. Just think about it. Go around in a build that you've done, or maybe a couple different builds you've done, and don't necessarily redo them, but walk through them and just think about, if you could tell a story in that build, what would you do differently? Or maybe you did tell a story in a build. Maybe you told a story and you don't even realize it. Just thinking about the alternative ways to approach a build and the alternative things that it might do outside of just have a purpose or outside of just looking cool. These are all things that I think we could consider as we build and create things in this game that could make us infinitely better, and I think also make what we do infinitely more impactful. Now, I've played a lot of games in my day, and I think the biggest inspiration for why I want to try this in building, at least from a visual standpoint and from something that really made me feel something, has got to be Elden Ring. Now, Elden Ring is not a game that's for everyone. The Souls games themselves are a pretty niche genre of game, and you've definitely got to be quite committed to play one all the way through without giving it up. But forget about the difficulty and about the actual gameplay for just a second. And I just want you to take in what this game looks like. Every last detail in the design of this game makes you feel a certain way. It doesn't just pull your eye, but these are things that get you thinking. This is an area that tells a story, and that is what I would like to capture. And so I've chosen an area. We're a bit further away from where we've got our fantasy set up with our house on the hill and our tree over top. If we come all the way out over here, we've got the ocean stretching out in that direction right there. It's just over the lip of this grass right here. And a little bit further down, I've got a bunch of barrels set up with some materials. Now, the ocean off in the distance, you can start to see showing up right here. It does sort of curve its way into this little inlet right here as the shores get a little bit sandy, and we get a little bit of a river starting to form its way inland off in that direction. Now, in typical Minecraft fashion, we've got a little bit of scuff right there where the river gets really, really shallow, and you can't really tell if it's supposed to be going further or not. But that's something to focus on a little bit later. And over here, we're actually pretty close to where we have our nether portal and our skeleton farm. Our portal's right there, and the skeleton farm is just up on this hill. World spawn is just over the way over in that direction. But if we shift our focus over here to the beach, I've got all of these barrels set up with various materials inside of them, as over the past couple of weeks, I've been preparing for what I want to do in this episode. As you can see in all of these barrels, I've planned out all of the different materials I will need, and I've gotten most everything, a little bit more than what I might need for some of this stuff, just so we don't run out. It's always better to have a little bit more than a little bit less. But as you can see, we've got all sorts of different materials right here, and you might be thinking to yourself, this is a lot of material. You would absolutely be correct. What we're about to put together in the ocean off of this shoreline will absolutely change everything. Alright, we've got ourselves a start out in the water. Now, there was no natural islands around here to work with, so I decided it would be fine if we went ahead and built up one of our own. The biggest thing with what we're trying to create here is something that is detached from the mainland and feels that way, but also something that as we go further along, you'll get a better feel of, really overlooks and almost overpowers a lot of the land that you'll be looking at it from. And I want that feeling to almost be a little bit of this intimidation or uneasy sort of feeling from wherever you are in the land when you look over at what we are building here. At least, you know, when it's fully done. As if the presence of what we're putting here is always on people's minds. It's always looming in the background, it's always watching. Or maybe someone inside is always watching, either case. What we're building here is, in a way, going to bring a lot of what we do in this land together, but not necessarily in a positive light. And on that note, it doesn't necessarily have to be in too negative a light either. Somewhere in between, like I had mentioned, a little bit of an uneasy or sort of intimidated, even ominous sort of presence, but not outright bad and not outright good either. With all of that in mind, I decided having it a little bit detached out here and on this little custom island would work best. Now, for the island itself, I went for something that leans pretty fantasy, I would say. I mentioned earlier how Elden Ring is a big inspiration, and I like a lot of what the terrain does in that map. You get a lot of these crazy rock formations that you couldn't really explain, at least I don't think you could explain from like a real life, real earth sort of perspective, but sometimes that's okay. You don't need everything to kind of follow the actual laws of nature. So I went for this sort of jutting out of the ground, almost otherworldly or even magically affected sort of terrain, where we've got these stone columns almost that are kind of forming out of the terrain. Obviously, they're not perfect columns. They sort of blend into this natural slope that kind of rises up from the water. But all in all, it comes up to the base of the spire that we will be building. And I think once you start to see the base of the structure come into place, you'll get a better idea as to how this terrain complements what we're doing. Before we get to that point though, I wanted to explain a little bit of my thought process behind what we're doing, and specifically with each section as we go. And now, with the base of the terrain done, we can move into getting the first part of the structure complete. I'd say now we're starting to feel something. Now this feels like something that would be in the back of your mind wherever you were, so long as it was in sight. It looms overhead off in the distance and provides this ominous and mysterious sort of presence. One of the biggest things that I wanted to do with this build is really hammer home a lot of the shading that we have going on. And not only that, but as a matter of fact, I used the shading to play a little bit of a trick on your eye. There are actually only 2 of these archways built in with actual blocks, and that third one is entirely done using shading. But of course, a build like this is meant to be seen from far away distances and meant to really fill that backdrop and just be there at all times, while not particularly being the main focus at all times. So what that does is allow us to play some tricks with things like shading and the blocks we're using. Now, those of you guys who have been around for a while will know that this is unlike anything I have ever built before. And I would agree. I've never done anything quite like this, but the whole premise behind this episode was that we are going to do something that will change everything. One of the main things I wanted to do in this series was catalog my journey to become one of the better builders in Minecraft. Now, I'll be the first to say, I'm nowhere close to the best. I don't think we'll get anywhere close to the best, but if my name's in the conversation at some point in the future, I think we will have succeeded. That's the goal. I want to prove that you can do anything you set your mind to. It just so happens that for me, becoming a better builder is my thing. And I do think with what we've got constructed here, we're off to a good start. But it's a start nonetheless. We've got more work to do if we want to complete the Ascendant Spire. Can you feel it yet? I think once you get far enough out that the fog starts to roll in and just slightly obscure what we're doing here, I think that's when this is at its best. Now, from here as well, interestingly enough, you can't actually see the water, so at least from everywhere up on this hill and maybe a little further back, you wouldn't even know that it's in the ocean and not actually attached to the land. And I think that adds to the effect as you get a little bit closer and you see the water kind of roll in on all the sides, and it becomes a little more apparent that it is indeed on this little outcropping of stone that's just got a little bit of grass and moss starting to kind of grow on top of it. I think that really plays into the effect that we're going for here. So one thing that you might be wondering at this point is we do of course have the door on the left side of the building over there, and that's not from a straight on perspective. How are we going to get to this tower? The goal is that we will eventually build something that connects, and it will go all the way across the water and kind of use up this space over here. And then from there, I'm a little undecided, but it'll either connect this way to the terrain or it'll continue straight all the way over to that shore over there. Either way, I think whatever we do back there, we can have a lot of fun with building out in this same style, some sort of bridge and maybe even some smaller towers, like a lot smaller, to kind of go along that bridge as it brings it to the mainland. For now though, our focus remains on the main build itself. As I mentioned a little bit ago, we're calling this the Ascendant Spire, and there's a couple of reasons for that. For one, it ascends into the sky pretty tall, and for two, on a little bit of a deeper level, something that I had also mentioned a little earlier was that I'm trying to take a big step here as a builder in all sorts of regards: technique, block choice, shading, and even building on more curves and diagonals. As you can see with the upscaled version we've got right here, we've made that a little bit easier on ourselves versus something that would be a little smaller. But the point being that I want this to represent our ascent as builders. So I figured what better name than the Ascendant Spire. And I think we can tie that in to a little bit of lore that we can work on over time. Something that we had talked about is telling a story with what we build out in this area. And I think starting with the name we've given this, that can be a really good basis to go off of. I mentioned that our goal was to go for something that looms in the distance, something that's pretty ominous and foreboding. If you're anywhere within the area in which this can be seen or that this oversees, it's always on your mind. It's always over your shoulder and makes you feel a little uneasy. And I think that's a great first step towards telling the story that we want to tell right here. By calling it the Ascendant Spire, we kind of give it this little bit of information that isn't too much. We're not over-explaining, but it just places that little nugget that makes you wonder a little bit, right? Things like, is the Ascendant a person? Is it a deity? Does it just refer to how tall the building is? There's tons of different questions that this can give you, just this little bit of information on the name. And that's something that I think, combined with the power of what this does, just being in the background, just being within your vision, starts to paint a really interesting picture and lays the foundation for a really interesting story that can be told within this area. Now, a couple of the fun little details that I've used here, I explained a little bit of what we did down on this first level, and then on the second level, it was a lot of the same, but there's a couple new things. So with each of these big windows, I tried to have some unique shapes in there. I didn't want to just have the same thing going on all the way around the tower. And you won't see it from this angle right here, but if you come in from the ocean, there's even a different set of windows on the opposite side as well. Now, the second layer only has windows on the diagonals, and then on the flat surfaces, I went for this sort of archway design, and it gets a little bit darker behind the top row just to add that very level of intrigue in terms of the coloration and shading that we have going on to this area. Now, I also did that deep slate tile technique right here where we've made it look like we have 3 separate archways up towards the top, and I'm not sure how well it comes in over the video, but that's just deep slate tile, and then we do have 2 actual archways with differing layers of blocks. But similar to what we did down here, that just kind of allows us to play a little bit of a game on your mind. Now, some of you guys may have already pieced it together. What we're building back here is heavily inspired by the Divine Towers in Elden Ring. I've talked about it today a lot already, but Elden Ring is going to be a huge inspiration to this entire area, and I figured what better way to start this area than by building something influenced by what I think is one of my favorite things in that game, at least from an architectural standpoint. Now, I've taken the base idea of what those towers accomplish and some of my favorite details from them and added my own little twist to it, but for those of you guys who are more familiar, you will know that there is actually a third tier that goes on top of these two increments, and I think I like that detail. I'm pretty sure we have some more blocks to work with before we hit build height. I can't believe it. It's finally done. I cannot properly tell you how many hours went into this project alone. It's been about 3 or 4 weeks in the making, a lot of creative planning time to get the design done, and then a ton of time to actually get it built in the world here, not to mention all the materials that it took as well. Somewhere north of 60,000 blocks went into this build right here. I was able to shave a good number off of the original estimate just by kind of trimming out some of the insides that don't get seen as well. And overall, now that I can see it in its finished state, this is without a doubt and by far the best thing that I have ever created. And this is only like our 6th episode of the series already. I'm not sure what got into me or what led to this happening, but at the end of the day, I'm super, super happy with it. And that's been something I've been trying to avoid saying is I like how something looks or I'm happy with it, because it's kind of been a little bit of like a crutch term or something that I'll just kind of say to fill space. And I'm trying to be a little bit more nuanced with everything once we see the result of it or as we're kind of going through it. But no, like genuinely, this is, I am really kind of left speechless. I to this day, do not know how this happened, and I've had the creative design done for a little bit now. It's just been a matter of getting ready to build it in an episode here in the actual world, and I think this is the perfect start to an area out here where we can start to really focus on telling a story. I've talked about it a bunch today alone, but telling a story is going to be our focus in this area specifically. Now, the style and theme is definitely going to follow this sort of heavy medieval, little twinges of fantasy, this kind of grim, darker kind of feel to it, that very Elden Ring or Souls game kind of aesthetic. But on top of that, of course, we want to tell a story with the builds. We want to paint a picture, and we want you to feel something as you are walking through this area, as you're seeing all of the things that we'll eventually put together. And I don't think a build has ever made me feel as much as this one right here. Whatever that emotion is, I think it might be different for everyone, the kind of vibes that you might get from something like this looming in the background. But it stops you in your tracks when you see it, and you can't help but just kind of take it in as it looms overhead. I think we've accomplished something really, really cool, and it just has me even more excited for some of the rest of the things that we can do in this area. Now, you can see just off in the distance over there where we have our house just in the fog, our big tree, and then the line of trees that's starting our forest in that direction. So we're not too far away, but I strategically put this here so that you wouldn't see it from that house. Now, the reason for that is that what we're doing over here, especially with this main focal point right here, is trying to tell that story that feels a little more grim, a little darker, a little more ominous, and that kind of clashes just a little bit with what we're doing by the house over there. So, if we make our way back over to where we have the house and our tree up on the hill, along this pathway right here, you can see that there's nothing out in the distance, at least with what our current render distance is set to. Now, if we start to make our way onto this bridge, which I had mentioned before is going to transition us into this area, that's why it was built in such a way that kind of clashes just a little bit with this area, but not too bad. As soon as we step up on this bridge and start making our way over, you'll start to see that it starts to render in way off in the distance. Now, obviously, it's super foggy from here with how I have my settings, But once you kind of crest over the top of that bridge, you start to see this in the background, right as you set foot on this area of the world, being that the river is our divider. So there is a little bit of an area in between where you can see both what we've just built, the Ascendant Spire, and our house over here on the hill. And I think that's fine. The biggest thing was just not seeing what we're doing over here, at least the main part, from our original fantasy area. Eventually, we're going to have a road that makes its way from the pathway through this area once we figure out what we want to do with different builds, where we want to meander the path, what we want the terrain to look like, all of that sort of stuff. And as we make our way closer and closer, the build will start to be a little more visible through the fog. I love playing around with the fog settings, trying to get builds like this to just slowly become visible throughout. I think the only downside is when you're too far away, but it's still rendered and it's just like a big white silhouette. I kind of wish it was a little darker, but and what can you do? At the end of the day, I think it's worth it when you start to get some of these looks right here. And I think it's a little bit better once you get right up to here. It's not quite fully clear yet. You just got that little haziness to it. I think it just does so much for the effect. And this is very much the main build of this area. We're kind of starting big with it, and then everything else we do from here is just going to be complementary pieces, or at least things that work well in tandem with this build right here. At least that's the plan for now. I can't build something quite that big very often, and as a matter of fact, this might take the record for new biggest thing that I've ever built, at least in terms of like one single structure. So definitely a one-off, one-of-a-kind thing, but I think we can take a lot of what we learned in this build and apply it to some of the other things we want to do around here. We're going to be using this palette a lot, along with some other palettes that we haven't done out in this area quite yet. But there's a lot of fun techniques that I learned here that I definitely look forward to trying to apply. Things like those fake arches just done with pure shading alone, all of the shading work itself that we've done up in this area, some of the new shapes that I experimented with. I did a lot of work with these columns and trying to get those to look right, doing things like flaring them out up towards the top, and that's a trend that you'll see all the way up to the very top of the build itself. There's a ton of small details all throughout the build, but given the scale that we built it on, I didn't actually need to do anything too crazy on those finer details. A lot of it is just the shapes we used at the scale that we used them at. And a good example of that is down here where we have these little notches right here, these little triangular shapes. These are just full blocks. I played around a little bit with slabs and stairs, but given the scale we're at, we really didn't need to do that at all. And it ended up looking better just as full blocks itself, which is crazy considering for most of any build that I've ever done before, stairs and slabs are needed and full blocks were kind of icky. But that's something that I'm going to have to train my brain on. And for those of you guys who are also trying to build a little bit bigger, something you guys will have to think about as well is when you're building bigger, you don't need as many slabs and stairs and trapdoors and the smaller blocks. The scale alone allows you to get a little bit more creative with some of the shapes using just normal blocks and some things that you usually wouldn't use if you were on a smaller scale. I talked about it a little bit earlier, but eventually we're going to connect the spire up with the mainland. We're going to build out here a little bit of a bridge. We might have like a smaller tower in the middle of the bridge, some kind of connecting piece. Whatever that case might be, I'm not sure when exactly we'll get to it, but that'll be something that needs to get done to get this properly connected to the land. We're not going to keep it completely isolated out there on its island. But one thing that I do want to do with the spire here is I actually want to put a creeper farm inside of it. That's something that I've been struggling on and very much needing as of late in the world here for all of the resource gathering and traveling I have to do for all of that. Having some more rocket availability would be great. So the goal is to put a creeper farm in here somewhere, and I think we can also get away with farming sugarcane as well, and all of the space that we have in there means that I'll probably go for something that auto crafts the rockets. We'll have a mix of gunpowder coming in and a mix of sugarcane being crafted into paper, and then we can craft those into rockets with the new auto crafters we have. So at the end of the day, I think we could have something where we show up to the spire and that's just got rockets ready for us to go. There would most likely be a benefit to keeping some of the gunpowder though, so I would probably try to figure out how to have a little offshoot to keep some of the profit. That's a redstone project for another day, however. Another thing that this build did to kind of teach me a little bit along our journey here in the Inspire series is that I don't think this should be the kind of series that's narrowed down to a 1-week window. We've been releasing every Wednesday so far. It's been a nice 7-day split between each of the episodes. but with what I'm trying to accomplish in each of the episodes, some of them might just need a little bit more time. So I think we're going to go away from the every Wednesday release. That doesn't mean that we're hardly going to have any episodes and it's going to take a month long, nothing like that. But we're going to shift to more of a loose kind of 6 to 10 days between releases and less of a hard line at 7. And that's going to allow me to try to get done the things that I want to get done in each episode without them feeling rushed at the end of it. A little bit in that Redstone episode that we had a little bit ago, we kind of had that feeling I couldn't get a build done because of everything that I was doing throughout the week, including trying to prep for this build in this episode here. So keep that in mind going forward. It probably won't be strictly Wednesday uploads, but we'll figure it out. Beyond that, I've already got some other build plans coming together for future things that I want to do in this world, but man, have I been excited for this to come together and for you guys to finally see it. I learned so much in building this, and I hope that along the way, even though we definitely leaned a little more cinematic with it and a little less tutorial with it, I hope that you guys learned some fun little tricks, some cool techniques, or you just had a good time watching it come together. Whatever the case might be, I would be remiss if I didn't mention a couple of my biggest inspirations for putting this specific thing together. I have been talking about Elden Ring all episode, and of course that is a big part of it, but I think there's two people in particular that I think influenced a lot of how this came together. One of them being BdoubleO, I've mentioned before in previous episodes. That's the builder I watch the most of and who has definitely shaped me more than anyone else. And another one is Hoef, who I briefly mentioned in the Redstone episode as well. I've seen Hoef do a lot of really cool things with this palette and a little bit in this style as well. And they've both been really good for learning how to build and getting some inspiration from. And I think from here, we can start wrapping the episode today. So thank you to everyone who stuck around this long to see the build come together. Shout out to everyone who's supporting the content on Patreon. You guys make this possible. I can't believe I finally got it done. We're going to swoop around here so we can keep it in view. But we'll be back in, I don't know, 6 to 10 days like we mentioned a little bit ago for the next episode. Hopefully we can get some fun stuff done. We might have a crack at this creeper farm and start to work on some of that as well. It might be a little delayed because we have some holidays, at least here in the States. We got Thanksgiving, so that might get in the way a little bit time-wise. But either way, we'll figure it out. We'll be back. We'll have some more fun stuff in this world. So until next time, I hope today you left feeling just a little bit inspired.